One of the most fun questions to answer regarding the endgame of One Piece is what the matchups between the Straw Hats and Blackbeard Pirates will be. It's no secret that the Blackbeard Pirates are meant to be the antithesis to Luffy's crew. While the Straw Hats have come to be notorious through displays of courage and honor, the Blackbeard Pirates get ahead based on trickery and deceit. With that said, I've looked through various Reddit threads and YouTube videos to see what matchups the fanbase predicts will take place. And while I find that most everyone agrees on a handful of matchups being a lock, myself included, I've also noticed that no one has seemingly ever predicted some of the matchups that I've been thinking of for some time. So I decided that it'd be fun to share what matchups I think are a lock and give my reasoning for each. Before we start, there is one issue that needs to be addressed. There are 10 Straw Hats and 11 Blackbeard Pirates. We're going to need to remove one member from Blackbeard's crew in order to make it a fair fight. Luckily, most fans will agree that there is one obvious member of the crew that won't remain a member by the time of the final fight. But what if I told you that the crewmate you're likely expecting to be the one to betray Blackbeard is not who I'm thinking of? No, instead of Kuzan betraying Teach, I fully expect that Avalo Pizarro will betray the crew and inevitably be defeated before the final fights take place. Now, why do I say that? Well, looking back at Avalo's very brief appearances throughout the series, I've noticed that he has fairly consistently been written to be a somewhat loose cannon who doesn't respect Teach's authority. When the crew was waiting to trade Bonnie for a warship, Avalo asked if he could be captain, before being shut down by Lafitte. Then at Hachinosu, he mentioned that Blackbeard always gets mad at him for causing too much damage on the island. Finally, during the fight with Garp, Avalo went on a rant about how he's tired of Teach hogging the spotlight and how he wants to be the one talked about in the newspapers. Oda has been pretty consistent in his writing of Pizarro from the end of pre-time skip up to the Egghead arc, so I don't think it's just a coincidence. There's also other indicators to Avalo being written as very independent compared to the rest of the crew, such as how he's the only Impel Down escapee not to be mentioned by Ivankov when discussing level 6 with Bon Clay, or how he was the only escapee not wearing a prison uniform, not including Shiryu, of course, who used to work at the prison. Then there's the fact that he was a king, which kind of implies a desire to rule rather than to be ruled. And lastly, you have his Devil Fruit. The Island Fruit is so overpowered that there's just no way Oda would give the main antagonist subordinate such a power without expecting it to overshadow the main antagonist himself. Imagine Luffy is fighting Blackbeard and say Avalo is fighting Jinbei. Any movement Pizarro makes would literally shake the ground on which everyone else fights on. It would be so distracting that it would almost force him to be the main attraction instead of Blackbeard. This is honestly the perfect fruit to give him if Oda is setting him up to defect from the crew. So with all that said, what will happen to Pizarro? Well, I can think of a few ideas. One possibility is that Blackbeard defeats him. Avalo has been critical of Teach, so I could see a future where he decides to go all out at Hachinosu to prove that he should be the new leader. Blackbeard would defeat him and show off just how powerful he's become. This is honestly my preferred choice as there's been narrative set up for it, and it could help build up Teach even more as an antagonist. Another possibility is that Luffy defeats him in his Gear 5 form. Luffy likely won't be able to use Gear 5 against Blackbeard, as Teach can negate Devil Fruit abilities. So maybe Pizarro will allow Luffy to get it out of his system first. It's not uncommon for Luffy to fight a subordinate of the main antagonistic group before defeating the big bad himself, referred to Mr. 3, Bluno, Caesar, and Cracker. This could be the same situation. Another possibility is that the entire crew defeats him, like they did with Oars at Thriller Bark. Now I would love to see this just because I think any scenes where the Straw Hats are working together are sorely lacking in the series, especially post-time skip, so this would be great. Two more guesses I had was that if Bonnie joins the crew, she might defeat Pizarro using her Nika-ish future attacks. And lastly, Pizarro could just be killed by Pluton. Pluton has been described as being capable of destroying islands, and if there's any island that I think is likely to be destroyed, it's Hachinosu. It just seems very expendable as we technically already had an arc there with Garp and Kobe. These are just guesses. My prevailing theory is that Blackbeard just takes him out one-on-one, but I'd love to be proven wrong. With that out of the way, we are now left with an even 10v10 matchup. As said at the beginning of the video, there are a handful of matchups that most everyone seems to agree will happen, so let's get them out of the way first. Luffy versus Blackbeard is obviously happening, no questions about it. Luffy is the protagonist of the series, and Blackbeard is seemingly being built up to be the main antagonist, or at least one of the main antagonists. This matchup will test Luffy's haki more than anything, as Blackbeard can negate Devil Fruit abilities. Side note, I wouldn't be surprised if Chopper also gets a chance to fight Blackbeard, if only for a little bit. There is some history there between the two, as Blackbeard did ravage the Drum Kingdom, Chopper's home, and Chopper did briefly make mention of this back at Fishman Island, so it's possible that Oda is setting something up here. I should mention that I do expect most of the Straw Hats to mix and match with each other's opponents. It's never been the case that the Straw Hats just tunnel vision on one opponent for an entire arc climax. Back at Enies Lobby, we saw Sanji and Califa fight before Nami took over. Nami fought Kumadori before Chopper took her place, and Zoro and Usopp dealt with Kaku and Jabra before Sanji took Jabra for himself. Even at Wano, we saw Luffy fight Ulti, Chopper fought Queen, and Sanji found himself trapped by Black Maria. I'll briefly give my predictions for which Straw Hats I expect to have brief skirmishes with which Blackbeard pirates as I go along. Next on the docket, we have Zoro vs Shiryu, another matchup practically everyone expects to happen. The parallels between the two are very apparent, as both are swordsmen whose captains help them escape captivity. Shiryu, being a swordsman who can turn invisible, will provide Zoro with a great challenge, as he'll have to train his observation haki to counter such an OP ability. I think showing how Shiryu was able to even sneak attack Garp sets up the high threat level Shiryu possesses, so I can't wait to see this fight. Now we have Usopp vs Van Augur, the Battle of the Snipers. This will not be an actual fight. At least not in a traditional sense. Here's the thing, watching a battle between snipers is really boring. Can you imagine if Usopp and Van Augur were standing like a mile away from each other and we just had to watch them constantly spam bullets at each other? I don't think anyone wants to watch that. Rather, what I think is more likely to happen and has been set up throughout the Egghead arc is how Augur's warp ability makes him the ultimate assist fighter. At Winter Island against Law, at Whole Cake with Kuzan, and now with Katarina at Egghead, Augur is always there to provide support for his crew. This makes sense, as typically in fiction, snipers are just support for the real fighters, so giving Augur the Warp Fruit to facilitate that role is perfect. We've even seen Usopp play a support role when he sniped Sugar to save Luffy and Law at Dressrosa. So, instead of these two having an independent battle, I think we'll see Usopp struggle to find a way to stop Augur from warping and saving his crewmates' asses during their own fights. And the only way I can really see Usopp stopping Augur is if he unlocks Future Sight. I know this might seem crazy considering how this is an ability only the most top tier fighters have been shown to have, but it just makes way too much sense. Usopp is likely set to go through some major character growth at Elbaf, and he could even meet his father Yasopp there. Yasopp, being a great sniper himself, who's also been teased to have amazing observation haki in Film Red, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up teaching his son a thing or two about observation haki, including the ability to detect where your opponent will be before they even get there. Having such an ability would be the ultimate evolution of Usopp sniping, so I think it's almost guaranteed we'll see it happen. Chopper vs Doc Q is another obvious one. I remember reading Reddit threads where people predicted Doc Q would fight Brook because of the whole death imagery they share. Then we learned that Doc Q had the Sig fruit, and it became clear that Chopper is the endgame match. Not much to say here, Doc Q can create illnesses, and Chopper can cure them. Doc Q also has Stronger by his side, a horse who ate a mythical Zoan fruit, turning him into a Pegasus, so I think the animal companion gives Chopper a natural enemy, with Stronger flying Doc Q away from danger and forcing Chopper to use Monster Point in order to reach him. I could even see a fun gag where Chopper is able to converse with Stronger and learns how much he actually hates working for Doc Q. Considering how Chopper's goal is to cure all diseases, I wouldn't be surprised if this fight ends with Chopper actually curing whatever ailment these two have. Maybe Doc Q and Stronger will even come to respect and befriend our kind-hearted doctor. Fans have noticed how similar Doc Q looks to Hero Look, which is something that took me an embarrassingly long time to notice, so there is a chance that Doc Q ends up being more friend than enemy. All I ask is that this fight isn't a repeat of the Ice Oni plotline from Wano. That was really miserable to sit through. The last fight that I've seen fans come to a general consensus on, that I also really want to see, is Franky vs San Juan Wolf. I briefly talked about this matchup in my last video on why Franky is the least popular Straw Hat, which I suggest you check out. The idea is this: Franky will convert the Thousand Sunny into a mech in order to fight the man known as the Colossal Battleship. It just seems fitting considering how heavily associated Franky has always been to battleships. I can't really picture any other avenue for his character to grow as a fighter, so building the ultimate mech seems like the only way to go. Before that though, what about Frankie in his base form? It might be a little lame if we don't get to see Frankie fight using his regular moveset during the big battle. Well, I think it is also a safe bet that we'll see Frankie take on Jesus Burgess in a wrestling match. The wrestling parallels between these two characters is not subtle at all, what with Frankie straight up using a German suplex in his fights, and Burgess wearing a luchador mask and what looks like a pro wrestling inspired championship belt. Considering Burgess has just gained the strength fruit, and he's one of the most heavily featured members of Teach's crew, I highly doubt Frankie would come out of this fight on top. Rather, he would have to take an L against Burgess before redeeming himself against San Juan Wolf. Okay, so Burgess isn't losing to Frankie. Then who would be the one to take him down? Well, might I present Jinbei. I think a battle between the two helmsmen could lead to a really fun heavyweight bout. Both characters are known for their physical strength, and most of all, it just seems by process of elimination, Jinbei has to fight one of the more prominent members of the Blackbeard Pirates. Despite still being a recent addition to the crew, it seems safe to say that Oda wants to position Jinbei as being one of the more prominent fighters. This isn't me trying to say that we have a monster quartet or that Jinbei has taken Sanji's place in the monster trio. I'm just saying that with Jinbei's resume as Marineford, fighting Who's Who at Wano, the man who ended up teasing the reveal of Gear 5, Jinbei's bounty being comparable to Zoro and Sanji, and him being featured along with the monster trio looking on after Green Bull ran away from Shanks. I think Oda wants Jinbei to continue to be perceived as an important fighter in the crew. That means that Oda likely wants to feature his counterpart on Teach's side fairly heavily, the same way Zoro and Sanji's opponents are always more prominently featured above, say, Frankie and Chopper's opponents. Burgess fits this role perfectly, as he had significant screen time at Dressrosa when he fought at the Coliseum, making him easily one of the top 3 most notable members of the crew, outside of Teach himself. I should say that it's difficult to really figure out how Jinbei may develop as a fighter during this match. He's such an experienced fighter that there doesn't seem to be room for him to grow. I'm sure Oda will come up with something when the time comes, but for now I'm drawing a blank. This next prediction is one that I spent a lot of time deliberating on. Nami vs Katarina Devon is a match that I think is a guarantee. Nami fits the same role as Zoro and Sanji, where she often gets to fight one of the more prominent members of a villainous group. This might seem blasphemous as Nami is one of the weakest members of the crew, but this isn't about strength, but rather narrative focus. When the officer agents of Baroque Works were introduced at Alabasta, Zoro and Sanji's opponents were the most prominent, sure, but Nami's opponent, Miss Doublefinger, also received special focus, with the chapter slowly building up to the reveal that she wasn't just a cafe owner, but an agent herself. At Water 7, there were 7 CP9 agents, but we only got to know 3 of them before they revealed their identities: Lucci, Kaku, and Califa. Those 3 being Luffy, Zoro, and Nami's opponents respectively. While Sanji's opponent Jabra was introduced later at Eni's lobby, I think it's clear that he was given much more focus than Fukuro or Komadori, with his established rivalry with Lucci and Kaku quickly propelling him to the forefront of the audience's mind. And finally at Wano, Ulti was by far the most prominent fighter from the Tobi Roppo, and surprise surprise, she was Nami's opponent. Of course, one commonality between all of her matches is that Nami is typically paired with a token female member of each crew, and admittedly that would have been enough for me to decide on this matchup with Devon. But for the longest time, Devon seemed just a little too inconsequential in the story for her to be a great Nami fight. To say that her significance among the Blackbeard crew has increased in recent times, though, would be a huge understatement. I mean, she literally has the ability to transform into one of the 5 elders. So now, yes, those two seem almost destined to fight as the token woman-on-woman battle. But that isn't the full story, as we also have to deal with Lafitte. You see, Lafitte is the navigator of the Blackbeard pirates, and with Usopp, Chopper, and Jinbei, I matched their opponents with the crewmates who shared their occupation. With Nami though, it's a little tricky as there's no real justification for why 2 navigators would have to fight. Most other occupations on a pirate crew, like Sniper and Doctor, can be enough to justify pairing characters in a battle, as these occupations often contribute to a character's fighting style. This isn't really the case when it comes to navigation, however, as it's a completely non-combative based skill. I mean, what are Nami and Lafitte going to do? Throw their log poses at each other? No, instead, Lafitte seems more like a Sanji opponent, right? Lafitte is easily one of the most prominent members of his crew, with him infiltrating Marijoa to vouch for Teach as a warlord and being the one who caused the Gates of Justice at Marineford to open, he occupies a similar role as Sanji as the member who comes in clutch for his captain. There is still one problem though. Sanji doesn't really gain anything from defeating Lafitte. Think about it. Sanji has already awakened the powers of Germa in his fight with Queen. Unlike the other Straw Hats, there's no obvious direction for his character to get stronger. Rather, I think it would be more interesting if Sanji had to grow as a fighter from a psychological aspect. So here's my prediction. Sanji and Nami team up to fight Lafitte and Katarina Devon. This just seems like a perfect combination as it satisfies the Navigator versus Navigator pairing, and would allow Sanji to overcome his fatal flaw as a fighter, which is not being able to fight women. It would be great character development for Sanji, going all the way back to when he fought Bon Clay at Alabasta. Both Nami and Sanji have something to gain from fighting either opponent, so I think this only works as a tag team sort of deal. I'd say at first Nami would fight Devon one-on-one and Sanji fights Lafitte. Then they swap opponents and defeat the other person. I'll admit that this is the prediction I'm least confident on, but I think it'd be really interesting to see nonetheless. On to the second to last prediction, and that's Brook versus Vasco Shot. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I just paired these two together because they're both the least relevant members of each other's crews. As mentioned with Nami, Oda tends to have a hierarchy when choosing which Straw Hat fights which opponent, and Brook has to sit squarely at the bottom of that hierarchy. He rarely gets any one-on-one fights as he is often relegated to a support role. I almost feel like the same thing will happen during the Blackbeard Pirates battle, but there are 10 crewmates on each side, so I think he just has to fight someone. With that said, Vasco Shot is someone who has left little to no impression on me. Even as we spent time with the crew in the final saga, I think Oda has been determined to write Vasco as just being the other guy in Teach's crew, which unfortunately makes him perfect for Brook. I want to quickly mention that when looking up fan predictions, a common matchup I've seen is Brook versus Lafitte, with the reasoning being their similar aesthetic, and while the similarities are there, this just seems too far-fetched in my opinion. Lafitte has been written to be one of the most mysterious and thus most intriguing members of the crew, which is why I think he has to go to Sanji and or Nami. As much as I'd love for Brook to get such a nice spotlight, it just doesn't seem likely given Oda's writing patterns. Maybe they'll have a brief scuffle before the final matchups at the very least, but that's about it. Circling back to Vasco Shot, I do wonder how Brook could believably defeat him. Again, he rarely gets to fight, so it's hard to imagine he's that strong. Meanwhile, Vasco Shot was a level 6 inmate, which is really insane when you actually think about it. It's been built up that level 6 inmates are some of the most dangerous criminals in the world, hosting powerful characters like Jinbei, Ace, and Doflamingo. Sure, Crocodile was there too, and he doesn't exactly scale to be one of the strongest characters, but he has brains to make up for his lack of brawn, and something tells me the same isn't exactly true for Vasco. So yeah, curious to see how Brook can defeat Vasco Shot when the time comes. And now the last prediction. I'm sure everyone has figured out who these two characters are. Nico Robin versus Kuzan. Now I know Kuzan is one of the strongest characters in all of One Piece. He's likely even stronger than Blackbeard himself right now. How the hell could Robin take him on? Well, the answer is she can't, at least not in a straight up fight. No, instead I think these two are going to have a discussion about why Kuzan is working for Blackbeard. There's just no way that Oda would write Kuzan joining the Blackbeard Pirates and not have been planning a major reunion between him and the girl he spared at Ohara. There's been constant reminders of the Ohara incident during the Egghead arc. Obviously Saul was revealed to be alive, and Kuzan was shown to be reminiscing on the incident when he joined Teach's crew. I think this is 100% intentional build-up to the moment these two cross paths. Now, like I said earlier, there will definitely be various mixing and matching of opponents before everyone settles on their final opponent, and this should be no different. I could see Kuzan fighting Luffy and even Sanji at first, before everyone ends up finding their actual opponents. How Kuzan versus Robin will end though is a difficult question to answer. I'm of the opinion that Kuzan won't necessarily betray Blackbeard, as assuming he will betray Teach works under the assumption that Kuzan views him as being so morally reprehensible that he'd never genuinely work for him, when in actuality, Kuzan is a man who already worked for a government that ordered the genocide of innocent people, and never once showed signs of wanting to take down the 5 elders. I think Oda wants to show that for Kuzan, the morality of pirates and the world government is completely blurred. This could be the type of interesting philosophical discussions Kuzan could have with Robin, and doesn't that just sound exciting? So there you have it, 6 one-on-one fights, with one possible defection on Teach's side, one 2-on-2 fight, Usopp playing defense and getting mixed up in everyone else's battles, and Robin and Kuzan having a sort of political debate. If it seems like 7 independent battles is too much for one arc, just know that Enies Lobby had 6 one-on-one battles, and that's not even including Luffy versus Blueno, or any of the other shenanigans that took place, like Chopper rampaging in his monster form, or dealing with the Buster Call. So if you like the climax of Enies Lobby, then this wouldn't be too far removed. Well, that's how I predict the battles will go. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my predictions in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.